So Dr. Richet, this will be the panel for storytelling and crisis management in sports. First, I want to introduce from St. Joe's, Jill Bodensteiner. And we have Ms. Weishaupt from Marketing Communication Specialist. And from Genius Sports, Bill Squadron. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Bill Mendel, and I worked 20 years in news and now 20 years in communications. And our panel today, we thought we'd first delineate what the areas of crisis communication topics are that each of us have worked with or covered. So they're player-related, performance-related, facilities-related, coaches or front office conduct, executive conduct, drugs, both PEDs and illicit, and then franchise, school, culture, and behavior. And in talking to the group before we started, we thought we'd take a very broad question that's in the news. This past weekend was the unveiling of Colin Kaepernick Nike ad. There's a lot of coverage of the national anthem, whether it should stand or not, and sports have become quite political. Is this a crisis communication topic from any one of the chairs, either owners, leagues, sponsors, schools, or the franchise themselves, including players? You have thoughts on that?
Well, thanks, Bill. I think I would characterize it as a very serious topic. I'm not sure I would characterize it as a crisis, but whether we like it or not, sports plays a larger role in our culture and our society than almost any other industry. It's more high profile. Individuals seem to have, in some senses, an outsized impact. We, unlike the theater or concerts, we play the national anthem before we start an event, which is interesting because it doesn't happen, similarly in other places around the world. It's in our culture, sports takes on a much more integrated part of our dialogue and our social issues and our political issues, I guess, than in many other places. So you really can't avoid it if you're in the industry. You have to deal with it. You have to have a, I think, coherent and thoughtful plan about how to approach it. I think those leagues, teams, other organizations that have been consistent and been thoughtful about how to deal with issues, whether it's the national anthem or many other things, have generally, I think, handled these things well. I think those organizations that are more reactive tend to have more of a problem. And speaking specifically of the national anthem and Colin Kaepernick, it's clearly an issue that's on everybody's minds. It's not going away anytime soon. Networks are even tied into it, whether they're going to televise the national anthem or take a break. I mean, everybody's being caught up in it. And you can, kind of question whether sports should have such an impact on these cultural, social, or political issues, but there's no doubt that it does.
Well, I think that a lot of times that when you're working in an environment of fear, and I think that's what the NFL has been working in right now with the Colin Kaepernick situation. They've been working in an environment of fear. They're afraid of what people are going to say with the national anthem. So ESPN is afraid to show the anthem, and they're afraid of what President Trump is going to say about the national anthem. So they're always reacting, like what you say, in an environment of fear. So when you're always working in that culture of fear, then you can't really put together a strategy of working for progress. So instead of actually working with the players and working on how to make progress on the national anthem and what the players are actually trying to say, they're just always working very reactive. So they're not really making any progress at all. So I think it's always working in fear.
My take is a little bit different because I'm in higher education. So I've just been the director of athletics at St. Joseph's University since June 1. And before that, I was in a senior athletic roles at the University of Notre Dame for 10 years. And prior to that was in general counsel's office at the University of Notre Dame. So I saw this from all different angles in higher education. And of course, in that capacity, we're balancing academic freedom, even if it's a private institution, the notions of First Amendment and universities being sort of the space where we can have conversations, and trying to encourage our students to take a stand. So is it a crisis communication? No, but I think for us, it's a strategic communication. We had a situation, I oversaw Notre Dame women's basketball when I was at Notre Dame, and in the heart of, Ferguson and others, our women's basketball student athletes came out for a game in black "I Can't Breathe" t-shirts as their shooting shirts. And we know what we had talked about with them beforehand was kind of with all of our student athletes, a three-prong approach. Number one, has the whole team talked about it? And you don't have to agree, but are you on the same page with what you're doing? Number two, can you articulate why? And number three, what's your exit strategy? You're going to do this every game, or are you going to do this in response to? And our situation ended up backfiring. And I say strategic communications because it really upset several of our fans. And I think there was some bias inherent in that. We got a lot of, women should know their role. Because it was a group of young women who were asserting their voice, but learned a lot from that episode. And again, I think it's a unique space in higher education in dealing with these issues. At St. Joe's, I've heard from a handful of people because we're a Nike school. And so that has been, we assume you're going to ditch Nike immediately, sort of from our fan base, and and just how to respond to those strategically and consistently with, again, academic freedom and the values and the goals of the university.
So how did you answer the question about Nike? It seems that Nike did a pretty good job of marketing its product and maybe splitting its bet, because it is also a NFL sponsor.
Yeah, no, I thought Nike handled it rather brilliantly, to be honest, personally. But responding to your fans, you try and hear people out, but make them realize. And the fact of the matter is, we're sticking with Nike, and just sort of try and explain why in a thoughtful way. That we appreciate people have different opinions, and we're. Again, we're an institution of higher education where we value disagreement. We value people taking stands, and we're going to stick with Nike and as an institution, and but try and handle it again, understanding. Again, we're not a corporation. We're not a for-profit league. We're an institution of higher education. So I think that's sort of the approach that I took in that situation.
So the four of us all spoke, and we thought that would give the audience chance to get some of the experience and expertise each of you have, which is slightly different, and just doing it across the panel this way. Bill, what is it like to deal in crises with leagues, companies, and teams? You've been much more on the corporate side. How does that play out?
Yeah, my experience running businesses, I ran a company that I co-founded called Sport Vision for quite a few years, and then I ran a business at Bloomberg Sports for about 7 years. And you're always.
Why don't you explain what Sport Vision did?
Sport Vision was a company that developed technology for sports media and had a number of products in our early years that ended up being quite successful, like the electronic first down line, and football telecasts, and the K-Zone for baseball telecasts. And interestingly, one of the crises that we had to deal with had to do with one of our groundbreaking technologies, which was for NASCAR. And we had developed a system for tracking each of the NASCAR vehicles and being able to communicate the location of those vehicles in real time. So for any of you that watch NASCAR on television, it's the graphic that sticks to the car as it's moving around the track with an arrow, and the picture of the driver and the name of the driver and how fast he or she is going and how far ahead or behind they are. And that was quite groundbreaking, because before you had that, when you'd watch a NASCAR race on television, it was very hard to tell which car was which and how far ahead or behind they were, whether they had been lapped, and so forth. And this actually gave some seriously important information to help the viewer engage and really follow the race. So it was a big breakthrough, and technologically, it was an enormous change. In fact, I would argue today that it's the most complex technology that's ever been applied to sports, because put a box in each car that allowed us to track via GPS, 38 cars going, 200 miles an hour within 10 feet of each other, and be able to communicate that data in real time to the television production that would then put it on screen, and we delayed the whole broadcast by about 2.5 seconds to do that. So it was very complex technology and all dependent on this box. Anyway, we were about halfway through the first season. This was back in 2001. And I was watching a race on a Sunday from Watkins Glen, and my phone started ringing just as I saw Robbie Gordon's car pull into the pits with smoke coming out of the hood. And, it was rare that I would get a call on a Sunday afternoon like that. And I was thinking to myself, I really hope these two things that I'm seeing happening are not related. But it turned out they were quite related, because our box in Robbie Gordon's car had melted down and caught on fire and set his car on fire. And of course, given Murphy's Law, he was leading in the race. And of course, the double Murphy's Law, he had never at that point ever won a NASCAR race. So it was, a perfect storm. And our guys were on the other line, and they said, they think, because this was something we had anticipated could be a problem and had actually warned NASCAR about, that the lithium-ion battery, which we all have seen in other contexts can be an issue, had caught on fire and then knocked Robbie Gordon's car out of the race and totaled the car. Thank God, fortunately, no one was hurt, but his car and he were out of the race. So we, of course, assumed a number of things. One, that we would have to go back to the drawing board and be lucky if NASCAR didn't simply cancel our contract, that this could be potentially damaging. We were still a relatively young company, only 3 years old, that it could be potentially damaging to the company as a whole. We had the lawyers already thinking about liability, all these things. But the question really is, how do you respond in the moments, hours, days after that in order to try to minimize what's happened and move forward in a positive way? So, not to bore everyone with the details, but we had our engineering team out in California in the office within 2 hours working on a different power source, so a solution to the problem. We didn't know we'd be given an opportunity to implement it, but we were going to have one ready. We were in touch, of course, with all the NASCAR officials. They immediately were, there was a big press event right after the race. They explained that it was the tracking system that had done this, and over the next 40 hours, and that they were going to have an immediate investigation as to what had caused it, and they would then determine how to move forward. We were as transparent and open with them as possible. We told them that we did believe we could come up with a different power source, but that we were prepared to, what we didn't do was try to protect ourselves or defend ourselves. What we tried to do was be as cooperative and open as we possibly could, and say that, we recognize we also had a little bit of cushion in the sense that we had warned NASCAR that this potentially could be an issue. They had chosen to approve that power source because alternative power sources were heavier, and they wanted the lightest possible, because that's a big factor for cars, is the weight. So we had a little bit of cushion there, but our approach to dealing with them was to be as open, cooperative, transparent as we possibly could be. Internally, we did what companies will do when they get into that kind of crisis mode. We had a board meeting where we briefed the board immediately. We advised our lawyers. We had them begin to prepare and look at what our insurance coverage and all the liabilities. So we did all the different pieces that you need to do to deal with that quietly, while externally we were being as supportive and cooperative with the league as we could be. Anyway, to again make a long story short, NASCAR was very supportive of us, and the main reason was that this ties into the immediate question. The television ratings had been very strong since the beginning of the season, and the improvement in the engagement in the picture from the tracking system really was meaningful, and nobody wanted to give that up. Not NASCAR, not the drivers, not anyone. So they were prepared to go ahead and test our different power source for the box within a couple days, and by the next weekend, we were back in 2/3 of the cars And by the following weekend, we were in every car, and that new power source is the one that's still used today, nearly 20 years later.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The point is that you had a very macro
Yeah.
issue. You had sponsors, you had teams, you had a lot of different constituents. Melissa's story is very personal. It's quite the opposite. You chose to do what is...
So I had worked in broadcast media for about 15 years, and then I moved over to the team side several years ago. And last winter, I was contacted by Sports Illustrated during the Me Too movement, and they had asked me a few questions about my time in working at the Dallas Mavericks. And at first, I was very hesitant to come forward and talk about my time with the Mavs. And if you're not familiar with the story, the Mavs are, while I worked there and the previous years, had a very toxic workplace. And so initially, whenever they contacted me, I thought, not really for sure if I want to talk about this, and I was kind of hesitant to talk about it. So after talking to the reporter a little bit, I thought, okay, I'll tell you a few things that are happening, but I don't want to use my name in the story. But also, at the same time, I had always kept notebooks from stories or from workplaces that I'd worked, and I started going back through and looking through notebooks and shared some information that I'd kept, and kept emails that I had also kept just from, just work information that I had kept. And it had been a log of information. So as we got deeper into the story, it came to find out there was about 20 other women that were also talking about this story. So the story initially was published in February about the Mavericks. So after...
One second. You wrote the story, not the story was published.
The initial story was published, and it was anonymous sources. So when the initial story was published, the Mavs came out, and this is their initial crisis because they started backtracking on the story. And I thought, why are they lying? Why are people trying to come out? And their strategy was panic, and it goes back to that fear thing that we were talking about Colin Kaepernick. Why are they going into crisis mode of fear and trying to cover up this story that's widely reported at this point? And the more I started thinking about it, and then I started using myself as a PR client because I'd worked in broadcast media for all these years. And I started talking to my friends in Dallas media and saying off the record, this is what was happening. And then other people started talking about off the record, this is what was happening, because they started reaching into the story more. And they started doing more investigation on the story. So eventually, Sports Illustrated and I talked about it, and I thought, you know what? This story and the Mavs story needs to come out. So I wrote a firsthand op-ed about what had happened because I just felt that workplace issues, we all deal with it. It wasn't a woman issue, it's a woman and man issue. We all have dealt with something not being fair in the workplace. And so this particular workplace was just so out of control. And so that's why I did it. And so that turned into my personal crisis, but it really, I felt I wanted it to be something that made that particular sports organization better, but then I wanted people to read that to make other organizations better. I hope that was the end goal. I don't know if that will be the end goal, but that's why I did it. It wasn't to go into a war with Mark Cuban. It wasn't to destroy the Mavs organization. But you shouldn't have to go into work every day and have your coworker who sits as close as Jill watching porn. You shouldn't have to go into a meeting with your boss and think you're going to get locked in a car and not get out. You shouldn't have to go into media dining with your boss and get hostile treating every time you sit down for a dinner before a game that you've worked a 14 and 16 and 18-hour day for a job you love. Because that's all you want to do. You just want to do a job that you love and just come back the next day and do work. And then when you ask him, hey, can you not talk to me that way? He asks you, I'll talk to you in a way I want. And then he keeps doing it. So that's why I thought, I have to stand up and I have to say something. So that was my crisis. Thanks, everybody.
So Jill, you are a lawyer. You've moved from a D1 school to a mid-major school. The culture that Melissa was talking about has got to be not as extreme, but it's a concern that you must have as the person in charge of creating that culture. What's that transition been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really honestly blessed to be at two faith-based institutions where, needless to say, that is not how the University of Notre Dame and not how St. Joseph's University operate. And so you're absolutely right to say, I mean, my job as the director of athletics is to create the culture and create one consistent with the culture of the university. I think my eye-opener in terms of Notre Dame brand and St. Joe's brand, and really just understanding the importance of kind of knowing where you fit in the marketplace. But at Notre Dame, which is an iconic brand, and then you throw in Notre Dame athletics, and then you throw in Notre Dame football, we had a situation that some of you may remember, some of you may be too young, but it was the year that we kind of had a resurgence and made it to the national championship game, and we had a Heisman Trophy contending linebacker named Manti Te'o, and this story just took, a couple lessons learned, but the bottom line is he was catfished. And, lesson learned number one, we didn't know what TMZ was, and we didn't take it seriously. I mean, there's a bunch of old people sitting around a room saying, there's this website called TMZ saying Manti's girlfriend was fake, and we're all like, whatever, right? So understanding media better than we did. But anyway, so Manti got catfished, and there were 8,000 to 10,000 stories about this situation. Meanwhile, a Notre Dame undergrad, current student, had a mental health episode and killed his parents. That got zero media attention, right? So one person got catfished, and it was the only thing you saw on the ESPN ticker. That's the power of the brand. That's Notre Dame football. That's the story. So understanding that lay of the land, you can't address a crisis like either of these two described handling very well if you kind of don't understand where you fit in that landscape. So, I went to St. Joe's June 1. I had my press conference in March. There were like 9 media people who showed up for my press conference, and they bye-bye, good to meet you. And I said, oh, heck no, sit down. I want to pick your brain. What do you run on St. Joe's? What do you care about? What stories do you follow about us? I need to know. Who are the players and kind of what's our standing in the community in a big sports city? Where does St. Joe kind of fall in that? So that when we do have a crisis, which is inevitable, that I'll sort of understand the brand in Philadelphia and where we fit into the media scene out there. So big transition, but I think that the key is really kind of understanding the marketplace.
And how much different is South Bend than Philadelphia?
Very different. I think there are 82 colleges and universities in Philadelphia, and South Bend, there's Notre Dame, and actually 3 or 4 other schools. But it's the presence is just incredibly different. So it's been really interesting for me, and again, really important to just kind of understand. And the other thing about being at a mid-major, the landscape in college athletics right now is so volatile. And, everything with basically college athletics is at a crossroads. Is amateurism going to survive the current lawsuit or not? I mean, we've got major antitrust litigation pending that could change the future of it. So everything I say publicly, I've got to take in that context. I'm always worried about being subpoenaed. And so you've just got to be, you got to be aware of not only where St. Joe fits into the landscape, but what's the big picture litigation and other landscape that we as a collective are living in.
Bill, you mentioned before that sports has a special role in American culture. How much different is running a business in America and running a business in the sports business in America in terms of how you deal with a problem?
Yeah, I think that there are certain things, certain basic themes that are applicable regardless of what kind of organization you run, whether it's sports or a nonprofit or a large private company or a small business. I think that when you have a major issue that comes up, you have a big problem, if you try to, as Melissa was talking about, cover it up or try to be misleading or try to somehow deflect confronting it, you're asking for trouble. And that may not materialize for a while. You may get away with shielding yourself for some period of time. But if, when dealing with a serious problem, whether it's an immediate crisis or a sort of broader issue, you're not direct, you're not honest, you're not transparent, you're not relatively open about it to the degree you can be working within the context of your organization, your business. Particularly in today's day, with every kind of media and social media and all the pieces we have to deal with, if you think you're going to be able to hide something, you're really fooling yourself. And it just is it's a wrong turn from the outset if that's the approach you take, regardless of the organization that you lead. I do think the sports industry has certain unique characteristics that distinguish it from most other businesses, because everything is within a media bubble. As Jill sort of indicated, you can have something that's sports related that's not life and death that becomes national news, whereas something that's much more serious and impactful nobody pays attention to because it's not sports. Okay, and I do think that sports, because it's so much a part of the national conversation, because you do have all of these competing social media and radio talk show and competing outlets that are vying for this, and you've got a lot of larger than life personalities. You always have to realize in the sports industry, not only do you want to deal with things forthrightly, but you're dealing with it in the bubble, and that sometimes increases time pressure, which can force you, or at least influence you to make bad decisions, because when you move too quickly, sometimes you can make a bad decision. So you have to balance all of these things, realizing that you're going to be under a little bit more pressure, but also taking the time you need to make sure you're gathering the facts and making a good decision. So, all those pieces, when you're a leader of an organization and you're dealing with something that comes up in the moment, you've got to balance all these things together. But I will say, and kind of conclude with what I started, if you start from the premise that you want to deal with it directly and as openly as you can, not try to hide things, you're going to, certainly in the long term and probably in the short term, be in much better shape.
In this day and age where an NFL team gets $250 million check every year for its TV rights, the question of spin, veracity, truthfulness, candor comes out. So, Melissa, you worked in broadcasting with teams. How does one navigate kind of getting the facts out there, getting at least a representative story, not just wishful thinking, spin work? How does that actually work? Because I think people are not really able to get a glimpse into the conflict between the rights holder, the public's sense of what's kind of so, and the broadcast partner.
Well, I think on that end, it goes back to what you were saying. Like, you have to be honest with your consumer. And so when we were working on the Mavs side, or even if I was working on the broadcast side, you have to always be honest with your consumer. So I had a total knucklehead that I worked with at the sports station. I mean, I'll just call it what it is. He went on a Twitter rant I was off one night, and you barely get a night off, and all of a sudden, same thing, the phone rings and you're like, this cannot be good. And he went on a racist rant against the San Antonio Spurs, and he was a former professional baseball player. And the next thing you know, Fox Sports Southwest, they're in an uproar. And so we had to temper what our partners at Fox Sports Southwest, I'll take care of it. Also, you're making sure the Spurs are okay, the Mavs are okay. It was during a playoff game. And then also you got to pull this guy into the office the next day and get a press release out. And then also make sure your on-air talent know what to say the next day because this guy's an idiot. Like you have to tell the people that you work with, but then also your listeners and then all the other people that you're working with, look, sometimes you make bad hires and sometimes they do bad things. So those are the decisions that you just need to make an honest call, and your strategy is honesty. And so it goes back to what you're saying. It's just you have to go into a calm, cool, collected mode and make sure that you tell all the people that you're working with. And that goes back to trust, because if you don't have that trust with the broadcast partners and you don't have that trust with the people that you're working with, whether it's an on-air talent or if it's the people that are watching you or listening to you, then you're not going to have anything. So I think that's really what it comes down to on that, because you got to cut bait with the knuckleheads.
So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.